Welcome to the deep dive. We take the sources you send us and, well, we dig into the most important nuggets of knowledge.
Yep.
Today, we're tackling a really complex topic, often very emotionally charged, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
And you've shared a fascinating presentation with us. It looks beyond the sort of day-to-day headlines, especially concerning recent events in Gaza, and asks a deeper question.
Right, it's asking what really sustains this conflict. What's the fundamental driver, according to this analysis?
Exactly. The common narrative, often frames it as political, a struggle for Palestinian statehood against Israeli occupation, land, rights.
That's the usual framework.
But this source, it puts forward a pretty challenging perspective. It argues that while the movement might be called Palestinianism, the underlying reality,
All right.
well, it sees it as something else entirely.
Something deeper than politics.
It's much deeper than just politics, according to this view. An agenda it traces back quite far.
Okay, so let's unpack this specific argument. Our mission today is to really understand what this source is saying, trace the historical roots it uses to build its case.
And explore why, from this particular viewpoint presented in the material, the conflict feels so incredibly hard to resolve, so intractable.
We're stepping fully into this source's world for this discussion.
Absolutely. So get ready for a bit of a journey. We're going back to the late Ottoman era, looking at rising nationalisms, the promises, the betrayals of the early 20th century.
All through the specific lens of the argument in your source material.
Precisely.
All right, let's start where the source begins its historical overview. Late 19th century, the Ottoman Caliphate is, well, it's crumbling, isn't it?
Right. It's clearly weakening, on the verge of collapse. And the source points out that into this sort of power vacuum, two key nationalisms start to emerge in the region.
Okay, what are they?
First, Arab nationalism. This was basically a desire among Arab peoples within the Ottoman Empire for liberation, for independence from Ottoman rule.
Makes sense. And the second?
The second is Jewish nationalism, or Zionism. And the source really stresses that this wasn't just an idea born in a vacuum.
No.
No, it argues it was a direct response to, frankly, terrifying anti-Jewish violence. The pogroms that were happening across Europe, especially in Russia.
Ah, the pogroms, yeah.
And the source highlights the scale of this, mentioning estimates of around 100,000 Jews killed in these attacks in Russia and Ukraine around the time of the Russian Revolution. It frames Zionism, fundamentally, as driven by this need for safety.
A search for security and self-determination.
Exactly. Now, what's really interesting, according to this source, is its claim that in the early days, these two movements, Arab and Jewish nationalism, didn't really interact with the idea of a separate Palestinianism as we think of it today.
So the source suggests Palestinianism as a distinct national identity came later.
Yes, it positions it as something that emerged afterwards, maybe an afterthought in the source's framing, within the larger regional picture.
Okay, that's a key part of the source's historical argument. Let's dig into Zionism itself a bit more, as the source describes it.
Sure. The source presents Zionism as this aspiration for a national home for the Jewish people, specifically in their ancestral homeland, including Jerusalem.
Their biblical land with, 3,000 years of shared history, traditions, language.
Right. But beyond the historical and cultural ties, the source really emphasizes the security angle. It wasn't just a desire, it was seen as a necessity because of that long history of discrimination, violence, lack of safety in many parts of the world.
Like other nationalisms seeking a state.
Yeah, the source draws a parallel, like to the Kurds, for example, another group with a shared identity spread across countries without their own state. It frames Zionism as a movement for survival.
And the source brings in Theodor Herzl here.
It does, a pivotal figure. And it notes he was initially a secular Jew, someone who actually believed Jews could integrate, assimilate into European society.
But something changed his mind.
Dramatically, according to the source. It points to the Dreyfus affair in Paris.
Right.
Herzl was a journalist covering it.
Right, the French Jewish officer falsely accused of treason.
Exactly. And Herzl saw firsthand the intense public hatred, crowds yelling death to the Jew, even when it became clear Dreyfus was innocent.
Wow.
And the source argues that witnessing that, even in supposedly enlightened France, just shattered Herzl's belief in assimilation. It convinced him Jews weren't safe anywhere without their own state.
That's a powerful story.
It led him, the source says, to write his famous pamphlet, The Jewish State, in 1896.
And then organized the first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897.
Which the source calls the first real step towards making the idea of a state like Israel a concrete political goal.
Okay, so we have these nationalisms bubbling up. Then comes World War I, throwing everything into, well, chaos.
Total chaos. And the
Yeah.
source frames WWI very specifically here, calling it a great game of great powers, meaning Britain, France, Russia versus Germany, and the Ottomans, basically all vying to carve up the Ottoman Empire's territory for themselves once it collapsed.
Right. And this is where the source talks about Britain making some contradictory promises.
Highly contradictory. First, you have the Arab Revolt, 1916-1918, led by Sharif Hussein bin Ali, his son Faisal, famously aided by T.E. Lawrence.
Lawrence of Arabia.
Right. The source even mentions his book and the film. Their goal, it states, was clear. A single, united Arab kingdom, independent from the Ottomans.
And Britain promised to support that.
Yes, the source points to the Hussein McMahon correspondence in 1916, where Britain essentially promised support for Arab independence in return for them fighting the Ottomans.
Okay, promise number one.
But then, the source highlights, in the same year, 1916, you get the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement.
Secret being the key word.
Absolutely. Britain and France secretly planning to divide up those same Arab lands between themselves. The source stresses the Arabs weren't told about this.
Wow. Okay, that's promise number two, conflicting with number one. What's number three?
Promise number three, according to the source, the Balfour Declaration in 1917, a public letter from the British Foreign Secretary, Balfour, to a prominent Jewish leader.
And this promised
British support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people.
So, three completely different commitments about the same territories. The source sees this as basically setting the stage for a conflict down the line.
That's exactly how it's framed.
Yeah.
These conflicting promises created an impossible situation.
All right, so WWI ends. The Ottomans are defeated. What happens next according to the source? The mandate period.
Correct. The League of Nations steps in, and the former Ottoman lands are put under temporary administration by Britain and France. These were the mandates.
And Britain got
the mandates for Mesopotamia, which would become Iraq, and for Palestine.
And the source makes a point about an early partition of that Palestine mandate.
It does. It calls it the first partition. Britain, quite early on, separated the land east of the Jordan River.
Okay.
That territory was used to create Transjordan, put under the rule of Abdullah, who was Faisal's brother. This area eventually becomes, modern Jordan.
So that leaves the land west of the Jordan River, Cisjordan.
Yes. And that remaining area was designated Palestine, sometimes marked EY on maps, as the potential area for the Jewish national home promised in the Balfour Declaration.
And how did the Jewish leadership react to this first partition, according to the source?
The source states they accepted it. Even though it significantly reduced the potential territory, the key thing for them was getting international recognition for a national home.
Okay, but things didn't exactly calm down in the remaining territory.
Not at all. Managing the Palestine Mandate became incredibly difficult for Britain. There was growing conflict, and the source emphasizes significant Arab opposition to the idea of any Jewish state being established there.
It became unmanageable for the British.
Pretty much. They eventually decided they couldn't solve it and handed the problem over to the newly formed United Nations.
Right, post-World War II. So the UN takes over.
Which leads to the famous UN Partition Plan of 1947, Resolution 181.
What did that propose?
It proposed dividing the remaining Mandate territory west of the Jordan into two independent states, one Arab, one Jewish.
In Jerusalem.
Jerusalem was to be under international administration, a separate entity. The source usually includes a map showing this proposed split.
Okay, two states, international Jerusalem. How was this received? The source is very clear on this point, right?
Extremely clear. It emphasizes that the Jewish leadership, despite it being less territory than they might have hoped for, accepted the UN plan. Again, the priority, as the source portrays it, was achieving statehood.
And the Arab leadership.
The source states, just as emphatically, that the Arab leadership rejected the plan outright, completely.
No compromise there, according to the source.
None reported by the source.
So the plan is rejected by one side, accepted by the other. What happens then?
Well, the clock runs out on the British Mandate. May 14, 1948, Britain officially withdraws.
And on that same day,
Israel declares its independence, based on the framework of the UN Partition Plan, which they had accepted.
and the reaction.
The source notes that the very next day, May 15th, armies from 7 surrounding Arab countries invaded the new state of Israel.
7 armies. They must have expected an easy victory.
The source suggests they did, expecting to overrun the new state quickly.
But that's not what happened in the 1948-49 war.
No. When the fighting eventually stopped with armistice agreements in 1949, the lines were different. Israel ended up controlling more territory than the UN plan had allocated. These became known as the Green Line borders.
And what about the territory the UN plan had allocated for an Arab state? What happened there, according to the source?
This is a critical point the source highlights. The Arab states involved in the war did not establish a Palestinian Arab state in that territory.
They didn't, so who controlled it?
Jordan occupied the West Bank, and East Jerusalem later trying to formally annex it, although the source notes only Britain, Pakistan, and Iraq recognized that. And Egypt took control of the Gaza Strip.
So no Palestinian state emerged from the 1948 war, even in the areas designated for it.
Correct. The source uses this specific outcome to bolster its overall argument about the conflict's drivers. It then briefly mentions later wars, 1967, 1973.
Right, where Israel then took control of the West Bank from Jordan and Gaza from Egypt, plus other territories like the Golan Heights and Sinai.
Yes. And this all leads back to the source's core challenging question.
Which is?
Given the sheer scale of the Arab world, the source points out there are 22 Arab countries covering a vast area compared to Israel, which is tiny. Why does this one conflict persist with such intensity?
Why isn't it just a political dispute over borders that could have been resolved maybe with that two-state idea years ago?
Exactly. Why does it feel different? And this is where the source presents its main argument. It contends the conflict isn't fundamentally political or national.
So what is it, according to the source?
It argues the root cause is fundamentally religious.
Religious. How does the source explain that? What's the basis for that claim?
It cites a concept from Islamic tradition. The idea that the land of Palestine is considered Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam.
Okay.
And specifically, that it's viewed as an Islamic waqf. The source explains this means it's like a holy possession, a religious endowment consecrated for Islam.
An endowment, meaning it can't be given away?
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Inalienable. Held in trust for future Muslim generations.
Ah.
That's the concept the source puts forward.
Does the source offer specific evidence for this religious framing being central?
It does. It points directly to the founding charter of Hamas from 1988.
What does it quote?
It quotes Article 11, which apparently states, "The land of Palestine is an Islamic waqf consecrated for future Muslim generations until Judgment Day. No one can renounce it or any part of it."
Wow, that's very explicit.
Yes, the source presents this quote as clear evidence of a non-negotiable religious basis for rejecting any non-Muslim sovereignty over any part of the land. And the source adds its belief that this core principle of the charter hasn't been abandoned.
Okay, that's a strong piece of textual evidence the source uses. Does it mention other historical examples?
It does. It brings up Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was a major Palestinian Arab leader, particularly in the Mandate period.
The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem.
That's him. The source mentions his meeting with Hitler during World War II, seeking German support.
What does the source claim about that meeting?
The source states he sought technological aid and, it claims, called on Arabs to, quote, rise as one and fight for your sacred rights. Kill Jews wherever you find them. This pleases God.
Goodness. The source presents this as further proof of a religiously driven agenda.
Yes, it puts the Hamas charter and Husseini's alleged statements together as evidence pointing towards a religious rather than purely political or national motivation driving key parts of the opposition to Israel.
Does it reference any non-Arab sources on this?
It does mention a statement attributed to the British Foreign Secretary back in 1947, just before the UN vote.
What did he supposedly say?
The source uses this to suggest that even the British understood the core deadlock. It highlights the Foreign Secretary observing that for the Jews, the essential point of the UN plan was gaining a sovereign state.
Okay.
Whereas for the Arabs, the essential point was their absolute refusal to accept any Jewish sovereignty anywhere in Palestine. They saw resisting that as, quote, an essential matter.
So the source interprets that British observation as confirmation that the fundamental objection wasn't about borders, but about the very idea of Jewish sovereignty.
Exactly. It uses that to reinforce his argument that the resistance was rooted in something deeper than negotiating the terms of partition.
Okay, so let me try and boil down the source's central argument here. It's saying that the label Palestinianism is, in its view, a political framing.
But the underlying reality, the driving force, according to this specific source,
is fundamentally religious, based on this idea of the land as an Islamic waqf, which cannot accept non-Muslim rule, a kind of Islamic supremacy, as the source puts it.
That's the core of the argument presented, yes.
Yeah. And the source's conclusion from that is
that as long as this religious conviction remains a powerful force among key players, the conflict is basically irresolvable through standard political negotiations about land or borders. because the core issue, in this view, isn't political. It's religious.
That is certainly a challenging thesis.
It is. It directly confronts the more common political interpretations.
So, wrapping this up, what does this deep dive into your source material really tell us? It offers a perspective, doesn't it, that pushes back hard against the standard narrative.
Definitely. It argues that beneath the complex history of promises, betrayals, and political maneuvering, the enduring engine of the conflict from this source's specific viewpoint isn't just about land or statehood in the usual sense.
Instead, it posits that a primary driver, maybe the primary driver according to this source, is this deeply held religious belief that the land itself cannot tolerate non-Muslim sovereignty.
Right. Which leads to a pretty provocative question for you, the listener, to think about. If, and it's a big if, based on accepting this source's argument, if the conflict's deepest roots are indeed primarily religious rather than political, what does that actually mean for finding a path to peace?
How would that change our thinking about solutions, about the viability of, say, a two-state agreement or any political settlement?
Yeah, does it make the challenge seem even more daunting? Or does it suggest different kinds of approaches might be needed? It's something to really mull over as you continue to explore this incredibly complex topic, having considered the viewpoint presented in this source.